6 years ago, on your first visit to this chamber, Prime Minister Trudeau said, "I wish you well in your task and comfort in your burden. May part of that comfort come from the assurance of Canada's abiding friendship for your country and your people." Mr. President, I make mine the words of Prime Minister Trudeau, and as we once again welcome you and Mrs. Reagan in our midst, you will know that that sentiment remains indeed unchallenged and unchanged in this House, in this Parliament, and in this country. May I say to you, Mr. President, and to you, Mrs. Reagan, that in Canada, you are among friends. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney introducing his friend President Ronald Reagan, a joint session of the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. It was April 6, 1987. During the 80s, calling the American president a friend in public didn't seem all that remarkable or newsworthy. And in fact, it wasn't even the only event in Canada that day featuring Americans. Also on April 6, 1987, the home opener of the baseball season for the Toronto Blue Jays. The Blue Jays beat the Cleveland Indians 7-3. It was the first Major League Baseball opening game ever played outside the United States. And in Ottawa that day, the American president and the Canadian Prime Minister were saying lovely things about each other. In an earlier episode of C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly, we remembered a time during the 1980s when an American president opposed imposing tariffs on Canada, when both sides supported free and open trade between the two countries. This episode is part 2 of what the U.S. and Canada used to say about each other. This time, we focus less on the policy and more on the personal, less on the relationship between two democratic countries and more on the relationship between two democratically elected leaders, the friendship between Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney. We pick up with the first words President Reagan said that April 6, 1987 day when he stood in the Speaker's chamber in the center block of Parliament and addressed a joint session of the Canadian House of Commons and the Senate.
Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker of the Senate, Speaker of the House of Commons, honorable senators, members of the House of Commons, distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to speak to you today. As you know, this is my 3rd official visit to Canada. My last 2 were the first foreign trips I'd taken after each election. But our constitutional prohibitions being what they are, I thought it wasn't wise to wait for another election before visiting you again. I also wanted to time this trip after March so people wouldn't think that these state visits were just an excuse for Prime Minister Mulroney and me to celebrate St. Patrick's Day together. On each of these occasions, I have been struck by how much our two nations have in common. Despite our many important differences, you see the similarities of our national characters in, among other things, the sports we share. Hockey, baseball, football, with some modifications, and that 4th sport, which seems to be as popular on both sides of the 49th parallel, giving a hard time to political leaders of Irish descent.
A year later, Ronald Reagan again cited their shared Irish heritage, and again it was in Canada, this time at the Empire Club, June 21st, 1988, marking the conclusion of the G7 summit in Toronto.
It is rare that a personal friendship between two leaders can change the course of history. Rarer still that it changes for the better. But I believe that's the case here. I believe that future generations will regard our work together as one of the great legacies of North America to the world in this half-century. No, we don't always see eye to eye. But then what 2 Irishmen ever did? So let me just pause here to say thank you for his vision, leadership, and friendship to my colleague and your Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney.
On April 5, 1993, Ronald Reagan hosted a tribute to Brian Mulroney. The event was held in Simi Valley, California, at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum. Brian Mulroney began his remarks by saying really nice things about his friend Ronald Reagan.
Well, it's a pleasure and a privilege for me as Prime Minister of Canada to be with you here at the Reagan Library. It's a particularly happy occasion for Mila and me to be with our good friends, Ron and Nancy Reagan again, and to see them both looking so well.
Then more talk of being friends.
The fact that we got on, we got along, President Reagan and Prime Minister Mulroney, some said Irish. We were Irish, now that I think of it. And we became friends. But more to the point, we recognized the importance of getting along. That sent a positive message not only to our senior officials and our governments to work together, but to the people of Canada and the United States.
And even more talk still of being friends via a famous Irish poet.
I leave you today, after this delightful reunion, with a line from the great Irish writer, William Butler Yeats. Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say, my glory was that I had such friends. Well, Mila and I have been blessed with such friends as Ron and Nancy Reagan. I am grateful that our paths have crossed and that our lives have touched. We shall always remember them with admiration and with affection.
In his remarks, Ronald Reagan talked policy in addition to the personal.
This Prime Minister has also energized the free market on the North American continent. His tax cuts and deregulation in the 1980s spurred 7 years of economic growth and unprecedented job creation in Canada. In 1988, we signed a historic agreement to eliminate all tariffs and many other trade barriers in our economies. Since then, our trade has risen to record heights and is the richest trading partnership in the world. But Brian Mulroney has not stopped there. He has worked diligently to see the day when the people of our continent engage in free trade from Mexico City to Minneapolis to Montreal. This day, I believe, is fast approaching, and much of the credit will go to the man we honor today.
Ronald Reagan also told this story about Brian Mulroney's wife.
You are a leader to believe in, a man with grand vision of freedom and the dignity and courage to carry out that vision. And through it all, you've had at your side a dedicated partner, wife and mother. On this day, we also pay special tribute to Mila Mulroney. Her strength and grace have made her an international figure in her own right, as well as a valued friend to Nancy and me, which reminds me of a story about Mila and another lovely woman I know. As a president, I was visiting Canada for one of our many summits. Brian and I had finished our working session and were standing together and waiting for our wives to arrive. And finally, we saw them walking toward us from some distance, and I just couldn't resist. I turned to Brian and quietly said, for a couple of Irishmen, we certainly married up. He wholeheartedly agreed.
A decade later, we would hear that story again, this time told by the Prime Minister. When Ronald Reagan died, Brian Mulroney gave a eulogy, June 11, 2004, at the National Cathedral. Here's how he began.
In the spring of 1987,
President Reagan and I were driven into a large hangar at the Ottawa airport to await the arrival of Mrs. Reagan and my wife Mila prior to departure ceremonies for their return to Washington. We were alone except for the security details. President Reagan's visit had been important, demanding, and successful. Our discussions reflected the international agenda of the times, the nuclear threat posed by the Soviet Union and the missile deployment by NATO, pressures in the Warsaw Pact, challenges resulting from the Berlin Wall and the ongoing separation of Germany, and bilateral and hemispheric free trade. President Reagan had spoken to Parliament, handled complex files with skill and good humor, strongly impressing his Canadian hosts. And here we were, waiting for our wives. When their car drove in a moment later, out stepped Nancy and Mila, looking like $1 million. And as they headed towards us, President Reagan beamed. He threw his arm around my shoulder, and he said with a grin, "You know, Brian, for two Irishmen, we sure married up." In that visit, in that moment, one saw the quintessential Ronald Reagan, the leader we respected, the neighbor we admired, and the friend we loved. A president of the United States of America, whose truly remarkable life we celebrate in this magnificent cathedral today.
Brian Mulroney told that story again in 2016 when he gave a eulogy for Nancy Reagan.
In the spring of 1987, President Reagan and I were driven into a large hangar at the Ottawa airport to await the arrival of Mrs. Reagan and my wife Mila prior to departure ceremonies for their return to Washington following their highly successful state visit to Canada. President Reagan and I were alone except for the security details. When their car drove in a moment later, out stepped Nancy and Mila, looking like $1 million. And as they headed towards us, President Reagan beamed. He threw his arm around my shoulder, and he said with a grin, "You know, Brian, for two Irishmen, we sure married up."
Then Brian Mulroney added something new.
I mention this anecdote again because it reflects a unique Reagan reality. She really always was on his mind. We all know of Ron's great love and admiration for Nancy and the elegant and constant manner in which he publicly expressed it. One day at the White House, after another glowing, absolutely glowing tribute by President Reagan to his beloved Nancy, I said privately, "You know, Ron, you're going to get me and all the rest of us here in a whole lot of trouble with our wives because we can't keep up with you." And the president chuckled and looked at me with that Irish twinkle in his eye and said, "Well, Brian, that's your problem, not mine."
Brian Mulroney spoke at a third funeral from the Reagan years, and friendship was a theme then too. He gave a eulogy for Ronald Reagan's successor as president, George H.W. Bush. Brian Mulroney ended his remarks at the National Cathedral, December 5th, 2018, with an Irish proverb.
As I looked over the waters of Walker's Point on that golden September afternoon in Maine, I was reminded of the lines, simple and true, that speak to the real nature of George Bush and his love of his wonderful family and precious surroundings. There are wooden ships, there are sailing ships, there are ships that sail the sea. But the best ships are friendships, and may they always be.
On April 27, 1988, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister of Canada, addressed a joint meeting of Congress. He began by talking about being friends.
I come here today to celebrate the historic friendship between Canada and the United States. On the border between our two countries, there are no fences and no barricades. There are no soldiers and no arms. That 5,000-mile frontier spanning a continent between two oceans is of itself a remarkable historical fact. It symbolizes neighborliness between two free and peace-loving nations. It signifies leadership, not only in the conduct of our bilateral relations, but for the international community as a whole.
And Brian Mulroney ended his 1988 speech to Congress by talking about friends again, and he did so, like he often did, by citing a famous writer.
And most of all, you and I, as legislators and as leaders of our respective countries, must continue to build distinctive and independent societies on the North American continent that reflect both the excitement of change and the strength of immutable values. Mr. Speaker and Mr. Vice President and members of the Congress, succeeding generations of Americans have known the wisdom of the philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote that the way to have a friend is to be one. Our two peoples, our two countries, have met that test in the past. We do so today, and I know that we shall in the future. I am confident, there isn't the slightest doubt in my mind, I am confident that the relationship between Canada and the United States of America, we will know difficulties, we will know moments of strain, we will know moments of crisis and tension, but there isn't the slightest doubt in my mind that, rooted as we are in fundamental values and democratic traditions, that this relationship will always be, as Winston Churchill described it more than a half a century ago, an example to every country and a pattern for the future of the world. Thank you.
Brian Mulroney's speech to Congress was the third time a Canadian leader addressed a joint meeting of the U.S. Congress, 1954, 1977, and 1988. No Canadian leader has addressed Congress since then. And now, a bonus clip. Brian Mulroney never lost an election. He served 9 years as Canada's Prime Minister. He left office in June 1993. That same month, he sat down for an interview with C-SPAN.
Maybe there'll come a day, again, when a Canadian Prime Minister will choose to have a hostile relationship with the President of the United States. Good luck. Or vice versa. This is not something that I would wish on my country. Because in the crunch, Canada and the leaders of Canada and the United States need each other. I mean, look, our trade, back and forth, almost $275 billion a year, the largest trading relationship in the history of mankind between two sovereign nations. It's complex and it's difficult. And if you let the people throughout the system sabotage what you're up to, then war could break out. I mean that in terms of war of words. You don't need that. And the signal comes from on high. The signal of cooperation and fair-mindedness comes through the American administration from the President of the United States. And he is saying, look, I get along well with Prime Minister Mulroney. I respect Canada and I understand Canada, and I want you to do the same thing throughout my administration. That's what actually happens. It then facilitates. And the same thing happens for me back home.
Ronald Reagan died in 2004. Brian Mulroney died 20 years later. Ronald Reagan was 93, Brian Mulroney 84. That's it for this episode of C-SPAN's Podcast The Weekly. A reminder, you could do your own searches in the C-SPAN video library. Learn more about the relationship between American presidents and Canadian prime ministers. We hope you check it out. For now, thanks for listening and happy searching.